When the realization kicked in that Negroes were no longer people's property, masters and mistresses reacted with anger, disbelief, anxiety, and even with satisfaction, right? There were many ways in which they responded to this new reality. And we're going to take a closer look at these in Dr. Litwack's 1979 book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery. It beginneth here.
Understandably, wartime tensions, privations, and personal tragedies had taken their toll and left many white families shattered, bitter, angry, and betrayed. Now, in addition to the other calamities which had been visited upon them, they faced the loss of their slave property and perhaps their labor force.
When was this? 1865, after the end of the Civil War, when the final blow was dealt that cracked the back of Southern slave society. The small percentage of whites who used to own people would be visited upon by their own set of struggles.
That proved to be more grief than some masters and mistresses were capable of handling. After acknowledging their freedom, Big Jim McLean, a Virginia planter, asked his more than 100 slaves to continue to work for him. None of them expressed a willingness to remain, not even to harvest the current crops. At this affront, the pent-up bitterness in McLean suddenly exploded. Seizing his pistol, he fired wildly into a crowd of terrorized blacks, killing some outright and wounding others.
Oh, snaps. It's getting wild early in this commentary, isn't it?
When finally restrained, McLean tried to take his own life. At this point, several blacks promised to stay for another year, and that seemed to placate him, but Union troops would have to intervene before he would permit any of his former slaves to leave the plantation. Although few of their masters reacted as violently, newly freed slaves had little way of knowing what to expect. The violent outburst of a McLean, based on his record as a slaveholder, probably surprised none of his blacks. But Matt God, on the other hand, had treated his 3 slave families like they were members of his own family. At least, that was how Anderson Edwards remembered him.
The other called us Major Gord's free
God had no sooner heard of emancipation, however, than he began to curse his blacks vigorously, proclaiming that the Almighty had never intended such a thing as
free
and, as Edwards recalled, his master
cussed till he died.
His last breaths were probably N-words and black sons of bees.
Having endured a hard bondage, which included being sold 6 times, Jane Simpson expected no help from her last owners, a temperamental mistress and alcoholic master. Anticipating no change in their attitudes, she learned soon after emancipation how accurately she had assessed their character. Like most of the slaveholding families in the neighborhood, she recalled,
they was so mad 'cause they had to set 'em free. They just stayed mean as they would low 'em to be anyhow, and as yet most of 'em.
Not surprisingly, the plantation mistresses, many of whom suddenly faced the unpleasant prospect of doing the cooking and housework themselves, often reacted with even greater resentment than their husbands, belying what may have been left of their reputation as the benevolent half of the household, although the master
took it well.
A former South Carolina slave recalled, the mistress, who had lost 2 sons in the war,
just cussed us and said, "Damn you, you are free now."
She had to do all the cooking and cleaning now, so you know she was hot.
At the same time, the mistress of a Georgia plantation, where some 200 slaves had resided, gave every indication of losing her mind after her husband acknowledged the emancipation decree.
I remembers how she couldn't stay in the house.
Emma Hurley remarked,
she just walked up and down out in the yard carrying on, talking and a raving.
I know the slaves looked at her like, what's wrong with her? Her life crashed right before her eyes. To them, this would be like someone today owning a profitable business and then waking up one day and realizing that the government had completely shut them down. Yeah, it might make you walk outside and start conversing amongst the different characters in your head.
To believe the testimony of former slaves, some of their masters and mistresses never did recover from emancipation, but died shortly afterwards from heartbreak and grief.
Miss Polly died right after the surrender.
A former Virginia slave recalled,
she was so hurt that all the Negroes was going to be free. She died hollering Yankee. She was so mad that she just died.
Here we go.
Nevertheless, whatever the actual cause of death, the former slaves had their own ideas, Within 10 or 15 days after his freed slaves began to leave him,
Massa,
Harry Hogan was dead, and one black he had owned attributed it to
all the trouble coming on him at once.
Come on with it.
Within 3 weeks after the slaves on an Arkansas plantation heard they were free, they buried their mistress.
The news killed her dead.
One of them recalled.
Now, are they really dying because of this? Probably not, right? They probably had some pre-existing sickness that was already killing them. But the former slaves did not care, and they didn't interpret it that way. As far as they knew, slavery ended, the master or mistress got real upset, then shortly after, they died. So in their mind, the news killed them.
And when
Marster.
Billy Finley returned from the war, his brother had been killed in action, only to find the slaves freed and most of them leaving the plantation. He seemed unable to cope with reality. His mother found him one day in a shed, his throat slashed, and beside him, the razor and a note which revealed that he did not care to live.
'Cause the nigger free.
This gives an idea of how serious the institution was for some whites. This person would rather return to the negative existence than to stay alive because the N-word free.
Still, the reported instances of this kind in the recollections of former bondsmen occur too frequently to dismiss them altogether as flights of fantasy or faulty memory. What remains crucial is that so many ex-slaves chose to recall the death of a master or mistress in this way, as if to suggest that their white folks had been so dependent on them that they were unable to conceive of a future without them.
Old mistress never get well after she lose all her
Katie Rowe recalled,
And one day the white boss tell us she just drap over dead sitting in her chair. And we know her heart just broke.
such testimony differed in no significant respect from how Duncan Clinch Hayward remembered the death of his grandfather, who had been one of the largest rice planters in South Carolina.
As my grandfather sat on the piazza of his house at the Watery, his former slaves stopped on their way to the station to bid him goodbye. All they said was that they were going home and would look for him soon. He never returned to Combahee and did not see them again. Broken in health and staggered by his losses, Charles Hayward could not recover under the final blow. The emancipated slave could look forward to a better day for himself and his descendants, but the old slaveholder's day was done. He soon went to his grave, and his traditions and his troubles were buried with him.
Right? The good old days were over with for him. The new world was manifesting. Now let's move on.
Whatever the quality of care owners had bestowed on their elderly slaves, emancipation, as some viewed it, absolved them of any further responsibility. If the blacks were no longer his slaves, the master might feel neither the compassion, the gentlemanly compulsions, nor the economic need to provide them with the same degree of protection, sympathy, and support. None expressed it more graphically than the Georgia planter who burned the slave cabins to the ground and expelled the occupants from the plantation. Nor did Will Davison, a Texas planter, refrain from making himself clear on the day he freed his slaves.
Well, you black sons of you are just as free as I am,
he declared, and he promised to horsewhip any of them he found on the place the next morning. Upon freeing their slaves, the expressions of relief voiced by some white families drowned out or blended indistinctly with the painful cries of betrayal and ingratitude. But this reaction reflected not so much a sense of guilt as a welcome respite from the vexations of managing troublesome blacks, as if they, the slave owners, had been emancipated.
I was glad and thankful on my own account when slavery ended and I ceased to belong, body and soul, to my Negroes,
a Virginia woman declared, with a fine ironic twist. Many a master and mistress thus managed to turn the trauma and financial loss of black freedom into deliverance from the chains that had bound them to their black folk.
And this was actually a wise way to interpret the situation, because regardless, the days were done, right? So instead of creating a story that would torment herself about how things used to be and how her life was so ruined, she used her creative power to twist the narrative into something that gave her at least some peace of mind, right? And others did the same.
The equally high-minded Henry A. Wise, whose popularity in Virginia remained undiminished, told a meeting in Alexandria more than a year after the war that he praised God daily for having delivered him from the
Negro dumb and
of slavery.
You see that? Because again, slavery was done, and there was nothing that anyone could do about it. Now it was up to the individual to interpret the new reality as they saw fit, right? There's nuggets all in here for those who have the ability to make use of them.
But he claimed to feel some compassion for the real victim.
He is now a freedman, but without a friend. But he is a freedman. I am now free of responsibility for his care and comfort, and I repeat, I am content.
Look how he crafted the narrative. And we know that this is an afterthought because if he felt this way before, he could have easily sold or freed his slaves, right? But this is a pivot in his interpretation, which again was a wise thing to do.
The expressions of relief tended to grow more vociferous as they became purely self-serving, designed only to cover a family's losses and to compensate shattered egos for the black betrayals.
I lost 16 nippers,
A Charleston resident remarked,
but I don't mind it, for they were always a nuisance, and you'll find them so in less than a year. I wouldn't give 10 cents apiece for them.
You see that? He did the same thing.
Similarly, Emma Holmes expressed pleasure over the departure of several house slaves.
For we do not want unwilling, careless, neglectful servants about us.
And a Georgia woman described the loss of a maid as
Good riddance. All parties quite relieved.
Now that the blacks were no longer a financial investment, they suddenly became expendable, but only some of them. While freedmen made decisions about whether to remain on the same plantation, their former masters determined whom they wished to keep with them, based largely on previous records of behavior. The sudden discovery that one of his former slaves had deceived him was sufficient provocation to discharge him. On an Alabama plantation, the newly freed workers affixed their marks to a labor contract, except for Arch, who signed his full name. That was too much for his former master, who ordered him off the place.
You done stayed in the war with me 4 years,
he told him,
and I ain't known that was in you. Now I ain't got no confidence in you.
Why did he have a problem with him signing his full name? Because slaves were not supposed to know how to read and write, right? There were exceptions, but most of them were not supposed to know how to do this. And for this slave to know how to write his full name means that he had been educating himself in an area that were off limits to the slaves. And if he could write, then he could probably read. And if he could read, then he likely had ideas in his mind that were unsuitable for a slave. And the fact that his writing ability was undetected by the master made him look suspicious and untrustworthy. That's why he said, I ain't got no confidence in you, right? Because at this point, he doesn't know what type of knowledge this person had or what he could potentially pass on to the others on the plantation. So he had to order him off the plantation, which was the right thing to do from his point of view.
The tribulations that awaited the employers of free black labor would provide still other excuses for discharging their former slaves. Thus did an elderly Virginia freedman find himself on the road to Richmond without a home. His master had become enraged after the able-bodied hands left him rather than work without wages, and he had countered this affront by driving everyone off the plantation, including the sick and the aged, declaring that he had no use
for old wore-out n****. I knowed I was old and wore out, but I growed so in his service. I served him and his father before nigh on the 60 year, and he never give me $1. He's had my life, and now I'm old and wore out I must leave. It's right hard, master.
Although not knowing what to expect now, he made it clear that he had no desire to return to the old bondage.
I'd sooner be as I is today.
Meaning he'd rather be a free man struggling than return to the plantation.
And with those words, he placed his bundle on his back and made his way along the road to Richmond.
You gotta love when people take a chance and stay positive. Now, it was out of line how his owner did him at this age, but this gentleman showed courage, heart, and he went to face the unknown, right? I know he was scared, but he still went, and he never looked back. And I really respect people that do this, right? So much respect to that gentleman. Now, from here, we continue to the next. I thank you for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.